The morning sun crested the colossal stone visages of the Hokage monument, casting its golden, sprawling rays over the bustling expanse of the hidden leaf village, Konohagagure. It was a settlement built on the precipice of constant conflict, a militaristic society hidden within dense, ancient forests, yet fundamentally driven by a deeply ingrained, almost spiritual philosophy known as the will of fire. On this particular morning, the village awoke to the rhythmic cacophony of merchants opening their wooden stalls, the distant, sharp clatter of kunai striking wooden practice targets in the academy courtyards, and the subtle, ever-present hum of chakra that bound the lives of the shinobi together. Above the labyrinthine streets, rising with an air of absolute authority and quiet melancholy, stood the central administrative building. It was the nerve center of the village's vast operational network, a place where the life and death of thousands were codified into mission scrolls, tactical briefings, and archival ledgers. Deep within the cavernous, wood-paneled sanctum of the Hokage's office, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of aged parchment, blooming cherry blossoms drifting in from the courtyard below, and the sweet, lingering smoke of an old man's pipe. Seated behind an expansive mahogany desk, buried under towering, precariously balanced stacks of bureaucratic paperwork, was Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage. A veteran of 3 catastrophic global conflicts, revered globally as the god of shinobi and the professor for his unparalleled mastery of thousands of jutsu, Hiruzen was now a man heavily burdened by the quiet, relentless attrition of peacetime leadership. The lines etched into his weathered face mapped decades of impossible decisions, personal tragedies, and the suffocating weight of leading a village that harbored profound, unspoken traumas. Standing before this living legend was Naruto Uzumaki, a newly minted genin whose very existence defied the somber, disciplined ethos of the room. Clad in an aggressively vibrant, almost abrasive orange jumpsuit, Naruto was a visual and auditory anomaly within the stealth-oriented culture of his peers. Having recently overcome immense adversity to earn his forehead protector, the gleaming metal plate that signified his graduation from the academy and his formal induction into the military ranks, Naruto was now required to complete the most mundane of institutional rituals, the submission of the ninja registration form. This ledger was designed to be a solemn historical document, an archive that would preserve the faces, vital statistics, and eventual fates of the village's military assets long after they perished in the line of duty. However, Naruto possessed a profound psychological aversion to conformity. To be just another standardized face in a bureaucratic archive was to him synonymous with being invisible, a fate he had suffered his entire life. When he presented his official photograph to the third Hokage, the image on the paper was a violent rejection of protocol. Instead of the stoic, disciplined expression expected of a Konoha shinobi, Naruto had captured himself wearing a bizarre, deeply strange face, his features contorted and painted with a chaotic, theatrical flair, reminiscent of an exaggerated kabuki mask. It was a loud, desperate demand to be seen, an aesthetic rebellion against a system that had perpetually overlooked him and cast him aside. Hiruzen exhaled a long, slow plume of smoke, feeling the profound exhaustion of his office settling deep into his bones. He stared at the photograph, then at the boy, recognizing the pain beneath the prank, but unable to permit such a blatant violation of official military record-keeping. The administrative integrity of the village could not be compromised for the sake of an adolescent's artistic expression. "Take it again," the Hokage commanded, his voice carrying the flat, immovable authority of a man who could not be swayed by childish defiance. Naruto's reaction was immediate, highly volatile, and deeply characteristic of his psychological profile. He crossed his arms tightly across his chest, his jaw set in a stubborn line, and vehemently refused the direct order of his supreme commander. The ensuing argument was a microcosm of their entire relationship, the rigid institutional necessity of the Hokage clashing against the wild, untamable desperation of the orphaned pariah. When it became unequivocally clear that the third Hokage would not accept the document and was prepared to stall his registration indefinitely, Naruto resorted to a tactical maneuver that was as unorthodox as it was highly disruptive. Channeling his chakra, he invoked a technique of his own infamous illicit design. The fundamental principles of illusion and physical transformation in the Shinobi arts dictate a complex, highly regulated interplay of physical stamina and spiritual energy. Yet, driven by pure, unrefined instinct and an abundance of raw power, Naruto bypassed all theoretical academic constraints, flawlessly executing the sexy technique. The sudden, overwhelming materialization of a voluptuous, scantily clad female form amidst a thick, dramatic cloud of white smoke caught the venerable leader completely off guard. The sheer shock of the display completely shattered the solemnity of the office and profoundly disrupted the legendary shinobi's physiological equilibrium. The sheer absurdity and unexpected nature of the jutsu caused the legendary Shinobi to suffer an acute, highly pressurized physiological reaction, resulting in a massive nosebleed that knocked him completely flat onto his back. As the smoke cleared, Naruto stood victorious over the incapacitated leader of the village, a defiant grin plastered across his face, having temporarily conquered the highest authority in the land through the sheer power of unabashed ridiculousness and shock value. The profound silence that collapsed the third Hokage was fragile, hanging heavily in the dust motes dancing in the shafts of morning sunlight. Before Naruto could fully process his bizarre, unprecedented victory over the village's supreme leader, the heavy, reinforced oak doors of the office burst open with explosive force. A young, diminutive boy charged into the sanctum, screaming a high-pitched, fervent battle cry that echoed sharply off the high wooden ceilings. This was Konohamaru, the grandson of the third Hokage, a child whose entire existence had been defined, insulated, and ultimately suffocated by the towering legacy of his lineage. Konohamaru brandished his weapon, a small, blunt implement, with the desperate, wild energy of a boy determined to carve out his own destiny. His singular stated goal was to defeat his grandfather in single combat, believing that by striking down the current Hokage, he could instantly claim the title for himself and finally emerge from the long, dark shadow cast by his family's immense historical prestige. However, the boy's grand dramatic entrance was violently aborted by the very symbol of his coddled, overprotected existence. Wrapped securely around his neck was an excessively long, trailing blue scarf, a luxurious, highly impractical garment that served as a physical manifestation of the smothering environment in which he had been raised. As he sprinted forward, his eyes locked on his grandfather's desk, the heavy fabric of the scarf tangled inextricably beneath his small sandal. The physical momentum of his charge was brutally redirected downward, and Konohamaru tripped, crashing violently face first onto the polished hardwood floor of the office. The impact was sharp and undignified, instantly deflating the grand heroism of his assault and leaving him sprawled on the floor in a tangle of blue fabric. Humiliated, his small face burning with a mixture of physical pain and deep existential embarrassment, the boy scrambled to his knees. Unable to process his own inadequacy or accept accountability for his inherent clumsiness, his developing psyche immediately sought an external scapegoat. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Naruto, who was sitting nearby on the floor, watching the spectacle with a mixture of profound confusion and mild amusement. Reflexively, Konohamaru pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Naruto, loudly proclaiming that Naruto had deliberately tripped him to thwart his heroic assassination attempt. Konohamaru fully expected his reality to unfold as it always did. In the stratified, highly deferential society of the Hidden Leaf, the villagers treated him as if he were made of fragile glass. They bowed, they scraped, they offered platitudes, and they never, under any circumstances, held him accountable for his actions or failures. To the populace, he was not a developing child in need of guidance. He was an extension of the Hokage's will, a political artifact to be handled with extreme care. No one in the village even bothered to use his given name, opting instead to refer to him exclusively by the deferential, ultimately dehumanizing title of the honorable grandson. He leveraged this identity immediately, chastising Naruto and explicitly threatening him with the weight of his grandfather's authority. He spoke with the absolute, unearned confidence of an aristocrat, fully believing that this invisible shield of extreme nepotism granted him absolute immunity from any earthly consequence. He assumed that Naruto, like every other villager, would immediately cower, apologize, and defer to his royal status. Naruto Uzumaki, however, was a boy who existed completely outside the protective warmth of the village's social graces. He was a pariah, a ghost in his own home, denied not only the privileges of lineage, but the fundamental right to a family, a history, and basic human dignity. The title of Hokage commanded his ultimate, unwavering respect. It was his absolute dream to achieve that rank, but the concept of inherited privilege and unearned arrogance infuriated him to his core. He did not care about the boy's grandfather, nor did he care about the unspoken political rules that governed the behavior of the village elite. Moving with swift, uncompromising reality, Naruto reached out, grabbed the young boy roughly by the scruff of his collar, hoisted him up, and delivered a sharp, ringing punch squarely to the back of the child's head. The physical blow was minimal in its capacity to cause real, lasting harm, but its psychological impact was monumental, acting as a profound catalyst for cognitive dissonance. The sound of the strike echoed sharply in the large room, shattering the invisible protective bubble that had encased Konohamaru since birth. For the first time in his life, the young heir experienced true physical and social friction. He was not treated as a symbol, nor was he deferred to as an aristocrat. He was treated simply as a highly annoying, disrespectful child who needed to be disciplined. This profound, shocking violation of his lifelong expectations did not instill fear or resentment in Konohamaru, as one might hypothesize. Instead, as he rubbed the back of his throbbing head, staring at Naruto with wide, incredulous eyes, it sparked a fierce, unprecedented sense of respect. The Konohamaru concussion, as it would metaphorically come to be known, was the exact moment the boy's worldview fractured. He had finally found someone who saw through the suffocating titles, ignored the political implications of his bloodline, and interacted directly with him as a human being. It was an abrasive, violent form of acknowledgement, but to a boy starving for genuine interaction, it was intoxicating. The tense, highly charged atmosphere of the office was suddenly interrupted by a new, imposing presence. The doorway was darkened by the arrival of Ebisu, an elite jonin assigned specifically as the private, specialized tutor to the Hokage's grandson. Ebisu was a man who physically embodied the rigid institutional arrogance of the academy system. He was impeccably dressed in the standard flak jacket of the high-ranking shinobi, his eyes permanently hidden behind small, perfectly round, dark sunglasses that seemed to narrow his worldview to a strict doctrinal focus. Ebisu's pedagogical philosophy was entirely reliant on the concepts of pedigree, standardized testing, and the strict, unyielding adherence to the established hierarchy. Upon entering the room and assessing the situation, seeing his prized pupil clutching his head and the village pariah standing nearby, Ebisu immediately stepped forward to assert control. He adjusted his dark glasses with a practiced, condescending flick of his wrist and began to lecture Konohamaru with a tone dripping in elitist disdain. Ebisu explicitly instructed the young boy not to let the presence of someone like Naruto bother him, loudly and confidently declaring that Naruto was entirely beneath them both in skill, social standing, and future potential. To Ebisu, Naruto was not a developing shinobi. He was the manifestation of the village's darkest secret, a pestilence that needed to be avoided at all costs. The elite tutor spoke passionately of the shortest path to becoming the next Hokage, a meticulously curated journey paved with advanced textbooks, exclusive tutoring sessions, and a complete isolation from the trash of the village. He firmly believed that greatness could be engineered through controlled variables, and he insisted that if Konohamaru wished to ascend to the highest office quickly, he needed only to stick rigidly by his side and absorb his superior intellect. However, Ebisu's self-aggrandizing monologue was delivered to an audience whose paradigm had just been violently shifted. As the tutor droned on, lost in the sound of his own pedagogical arrogance, Konohamaru wasn't listening. The sharp sting on the back of his head was a revelation. He realized with the sudden, crystal-clear intuition of a child that Naruto possessed something infinitely more valuable than Ebisu's textbooks: the raw, unfiltered courage to defy the Hokage, the system, and the heavy expectations of the village. While Ebisu stood facing the center of the room, lecturing with closed eyes and a raised finger, Konohamaru quietly, methodically backed away. Utilizing the natural shadows of the office, the boy slipped out the open doors, embarking on a pursuit of the one person who had treated him as a human being. It was only when Ebisu finally paused his lengthy diatribe to await his pupil's inevitable, grateful agreement that he realized he was speaking to empty air. The silence in the room stretched out, followed by a sudden, cold wave of absolute panic. Losing the Hokage's grandson, the most politically sensitive child in the entire village, was a catastrophic, career-ending failure of epic proportions. Ebisu's composed elite facade shattered instantly, and he rushed frantically out of the administrative building, his dark glasses slipping down his nose as he began a desperate search through the streets of Konohamaru. Naruto walked aimlessly through the sunlit, vibrant streets of the Hidden Leaf. The village was a sprawling labyrinth of wooden storefronts, brightly colored banners, and intersecting dirt pathways that smelled of roasting meat, fresh rain, and damp earth. As he moved through the civilian sectors, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, Naruto became acutely aware of a persistent, highly conspicuous sensation of being followed. He was entirely accustomed to the heavy, oppressive stares of the villagers, the silent, hateful glares that tracked his every movement. But this surveillance was fundamentally different. It lacked malice. Instead, it was characterized by a profound, almost comical lack of skill. Konohamaru was attempting to tail his new idol, employing a series of covert camouflage techniques he had presumably gleaned from children's stories rather than actual shinobi training. The young boy's attempts at stealth were tragically inept, relying on absurd, superficial props rather than genuine environmental blending. Naruto paused near a small intersection, his patience wearing thin as he watched a perfectly square rock with eye holes attempt to inch closer to him across the open street. With a deep, dramatic sigh, he turned around and loudly called out the terrible disguise, pointing out the sheer absurdity of a rock moving through the middle of the road. Instead of experiencing the embarrassment of failure, Konohamaru threw off the painted cardboard box with a burst of genuine, unbridled delight. His eyes were wide, shining with profound admiration. To the sheltered boy, the fact that Naruto could see through his masterful camouflage was not evidence of his own ineptitude, but rather irrefutable proof of Naruto's elite, almost mythical shinobi perception. "Saw through my disguise, huh?" Konohamaru laughed, his voice brimming with excitement. He bounded forward, stopping just short of Naruto, and pointed a dramatic, commanding finger at the older boy. Without hesitation, he announced his intention to become Naruto's apprentice, explicitly ordering the genin to become his new trainer. His ultimate goal, he declared, was to master the incredible, reality-bending sexy technique that had so effectively neutralized his grandfather. Naruto frowned, his expression darkening with acute disinterest. He turned his back on the boy, folding his arms. He had finally graduated from the academy. He had his own immense hurdles to overcome, his own training to manage, and a massive deficit of respect to earn from the village. He had absolutely no time nor the inclination to babysit a spoiled, privileged child who viewed the brutal reality of the ninja world as an entertaining game. He began to walk away, fully intending to leave Konohamaru standing in the dust. Then the boy spoke a single transformative word. "Please, boss?" The impact of that specific syllable upon Naruto's psyche cannot be overstated. Here was a boy whose entire 12 years of existence had been characterized by a relentless barrage of deeply negative nomenclature. He had been called a monster, a pest, a failure, a demon, and a nuisance. He had been actively shunned, structurally isolated, and starved of even the most basic forms of human validation. Suddenly, standing in the middle of the street, a child was looking up to him not with fear, nor with hatred, but with pure, unadulterated reverence. The title of boss was not merely a stroke to his adolescent ego, it was a profound linguistic validation of his worth as a leader and as a human being. "Me? Boss?" Naruto asked, his eyes widening as he pointed to himself in sheer disbelief. The sheer, overwhelming warmth of being acknowledged washed over him, completely overriding his previous annoyance. Naruto stopped, a massive, uncontrollable grin spreading across his face. He turned back to Konohamaru, his chest puffed out with a newfound sense of immense responsibility, and eagerly accepted the role of mentor. The unlikely pair retreated from the populated center of the village, venturing into the dense, ancient woods that bordered Konohakagure. Here, surrounded by towering oak and pine trees, away from the judgmental eyes of the civilian populace and the rigid strictures of the academy, the training commenced. It was a rigorous, highly unorthodox curriculum that focused less on the traditional militaristic applications of chakra and more on the philosophical underpinnings of the transformation jutsu. Naruto paced before his eager student, explaining that the key to executing the perfect illusion was not merely the precise manipulation of energy, but the absolute, uncompromising embrace of the persona. It required a complete abandonment of shame, a total commitment to the shock value of the act. as Konohamaru struggled to mold his chakra, resulting in a series of hilariously disproportionate and flawed physical manifestations. The physical exhaustion began to peel back the layers of their bravado. During a prolonged period of rest, the two boys sat side by side on the damp, mossy ground, the afternoon sun filtering in dappled patches through the canopy above. The manic energy of the training faded, replaced by a quiet, introspective stillness. Konohamaru looked down at his small hands, the dirt beneath his fingernails a stark contrast to the pristine, sheltered life he usually led. The brash, commanding tone he had used all morning dissolved into a quiet, vulnerable honesty. He turned to his new mentor and finally articulated the crushing, invisible weight that governed his life. He explained that his ultimate ambition, his desperate, burning desire to ascend to the rank of Hokage, was not driven by a lust for political power, nor a desire for military dominance. It was a deeply personal, existential cry for recognition. "Whenever anyone looks at me, they don't see me," Konohamaru confessed, his voice barely rising above the rustle of the leaves. "They only see the grandson of the third Hokage. Nobody even calls me by my name. I'm just honorable grandson." He described the suffocating reality of living as an extension of a monument, of having his individual achievements, his failures, and his very identity swallowed whole by the massive, inescapable shadow cast by Hiruzen Sarutobi. To the village, he was not a boy, he was a political artifact. He believed with the absolute conviction of childhood logic that the only way to force the village to look at him, to truly see Konohamaru as an independent entity, was to claim the highest possible title for himself, thereby eclipsing the grandfather who inadvertently imprisoned him. Naruto sat in profound silence, listening to the young boy's confession. The resonance of Konohamaru's pain was deafening. To any outside observer, their lives were diametrically opposed. One was the ultimate insider, cloaked in the highest privilege the village could offer. The other was the ultimate outsider, cursed with a legacy of unimaginable darkness. Yet, sitting in the quiet of the forest, Naruto realized they were fundamentally two sides of the exact same coin. Naruto was utterly invisible to the village because they only saw the monstrous demon sealed within his body. Konohamaru was utterly invisible because the village only saw the saintly legacy of his grandfather. Both boys were drowning in the perceptions of others, completely denied their right to exist as individuals. They both engaged in outrageous, disruptive acts of rebellion, Naruto through vandalism and pranks, Konohamaru through clumsy assassinations and bad disguises, for the exact same psychological reason, a desperate, starving need for human acknowledgement. In that quiet moment in the woods, the superficial dynamic of boss and apprentice evolved into a profound, unbreakable bond forged in the fires of shared isolation. As the afternoon waned into early evening, the sky above Konohagakure transformed into a brilliant tapestry of bruised purples and fiery oranges. High above the civilian sectors, standing on the expansive, flat rooftop of the central administrative building, the third Hokage gazed out over the village he had sworn to protect. The dying light of the sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the sheer cliff face of the Hokage monument, heavily accentuating the carved, stoic features of the first, second, third, and fourth Hokages. It was a visual reminder of the heavy, continuous chain of sacrifice that kept the village alive. Joining the elderly leader on the rooftop was Iruka Umino, a Chunin instructor from the academy and one of the very few individuals in the village who looked at Naruto Uzumaki with genuine compassion. Iruka stood beside the Hokage, watching the smoke from Hiruzen's pipe drift upward into the cooling air. The instructor spoke softly of Naruto, expressing a fragile, hopeful optimism. He shared his belief that Naruto's recent graduation and the physical acquisition of the Genin headband would serve as a catalyst for a paradigm shift. He hoped that by officially becoming a shinobi of the leaf, the villagers would finally begin to view Naruto differently, seeing him as a protector rather than a pariah. Hiruzen did not immediately respond. He took a long, slow draw from his pipe, his eyes reflecting the deep, intractable sorrow of a man who understood the darkest, most unyielding corners of human nature. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy, carrying the weight of historical inevitability. "People don't change that easily," he murmured, the words cutting through the optimistic twilight like a cold blade. The third Hokage proceeded to articulate the profound, deeply entrenched psychological trauma that gripped the entire population of the village. He recounted the horrific events of exactly 12 years prior, when the catastrophic, unnatural disaster known as the nine-tailed demon fox had suddenly materialized within the borders of Konohagakure. The beast was a force of pure, unadulterated destruction, leveling infrastructure and slaughtering countless shinobi and civilians alike. To save the village from absolute annihilation, the leader at the time, the brilliant and beloved fourth Hokage, sacrificed his own life to perform an ultimate forbidden sealing jutsu, trapping the immense, malevolent chakra of the nine tails into the body of a newborn infant, Naruto Uzumaki. The tactical necessity of the act was undeniable, but the sociological fallout was devastating. Hiruzen explained to Iruka the tragic mechanics of collective grief and fear. The adults of the village, the survivors who had lost spouses, children, and parents to the beast's claws, were psychologically incapable of separating the innocent vessel from the monster contained within. When they looked at the blonde-haired orphan, they did not see a child. They saw the physical embodiment of their greatest nightmare, the living, breathing monument to their deepest sorrow. Out of this profound fear and unprocessed anger, they viewed Naruto as the nine tails itself. In a desperate, ultimately flawed attempt to protect the boy from the village's wrath, Hiruzen had instituted a strict, draconian law forbidding anyone from speaking of the beast or its sealing. However, the legislation of silence could not mandate emotion. The decree only forced the hatred underground, where it festered, mutated, and was passed on silently, atmospherically, to the next generation. The children of the village, taking their behavioral cues from the cold, fearful glares of their parents, inherited the exact same animosity towards Naruto without ever knowing the historical reason why. Hiruzen's discourse was a masterclass in the tragic reality of leadership. He understood that a simple piece of metal on the boy's forehead could not easily overwrite a decade of deeply entrenched, structurally reinforced terror. The fear was immutable, baked into the very foundational bedrock of the village's collective psyche. Naruto's path to acknowledgement would not be granted by an institution. It would have to be fought for, inch by bloody inch, against the overwhelming tide of human prejudice. While the Hokage lamented the philosophical failings of the village high above, a more immediate, visceral conflict was reaching its boiling point in the darkening woods below. The peaceful quiet of Naruto and Konohamaru's shared revelation was shattered by the sudden, aggressive rustling of leaves. Dropping from the canopy with the lethal, silent grace of an elite jonin, Ebisu finally tracked down his errant pupil. Ebisu's posture was rigid with anger, his dark glasses reflecting the fading light. He was appalled to find the honorable grandson associating with the village pariah in the dirt of the forest. He immediately commanded Konohamaru to step away from Naruto, viewing the genin not just as a nuisance, but an active, corrupting influence on the boy's moral and tactical development. Ebisu demanded that Konohamaru return to the sterile, highly controlled environment of his official tutoring, explicitly threatening the boy with the consequences of deviating from the shortest path to leadership. But the Konohamaru who stood before Ebisu in the twilight was fundamentally different from the boy who had fled the office hours earlier. Empowered by Naruto's acknowledgement and the realization that his own identity was worth fighting for, Konohamaru stood his ground. He vehemently refused to return to Ebisu's suffocating curriculum. With a voice trembling but resolute, he announced that he was currently learning the ultimate technique required to beat his grandfather and claim the title of Hokage on his own terms. To demonstrate his newfound resolve and his progression as an apprentice, he closed his eyes in deep concentration, formed the necessary hand seal, and violently molded his chakra. A cloud of white smoke erupted around him as he attempted to perform his newly learned sexy technique. However, the execution was tragically flawed. The resulting physical manifestation was a bizarre, heavily disproportionate amalgamation of features that lacked the seamless cognitive visualization required for the illusion to take hold. Ebisu was not stunned, nor was he defeated by the display. He was merely deeply, profoundly appalled. To the elite tutor, this crude, highly inappropriate jutsu was the ultimate proof that Naruto was actively ruining the Hokage's legacy and turning the boy into a delinquent. Filled with self-righteous fury, Ebisu deemed Naruto a threat beyond saving and stepped forward aggressively, his hands reaching out to physically tear Konohamaru away by force. Naruto, recognizing the immediate threat to his first true disciple, stepped firmly into the space between the elite jonin and the young boy. Ebisu scoffed at the gesture, confident in the massive disparity of power between a seasoned elite and a fresh, perpetually failing academy graduate. He prepared himself to quickly, efficiently dispatch the boy. But Naruto's response was not a crude physical attack. With eyes blazing with absolute defiance, he brought his fingers together to form a complex, cross-shaped hand seal. He focused his immense, churning reserves of chakra and invoked an advanced, highly classified B-rank forbidden jutsu, the Shadow Clone Technique. The clearing was instantly flooded with a massive percussive wave of smoke. When it cleared, Ebisu found himself completely surrounded by dozens of perfectly corporeal, fully autonomous copies of Naruto Uzumaki. The elite tutor was momentarily paralyzed by shock. The sheer volume of chakra required to physically partition one's spiritual energy so many times was staggering, far beyond the theoretical limits of a genin. But the true devastation of the attack lay not in physical violence, but in psychological warfare. Before Ebisu could mount a defense, the dozens of clones moved in perfect, terrifying synchronization. They all formed a secondary hand seal, layering a transformation jutsu on top of the physical clones. This was Naruto's ultimate, unholy synthesis of raw power and absolute absurdity, the harem jutsu. The dark woods were suddenly illuminated by the appearance of dozens of perfectly proportioned, voluptuous female forms, completely overwhelming Ebisu's field of vision. For a man whose entire identity was built upon the foundations of extreme, rigid discipline, strict adherence to protocol, and the total suppression of improper emotional responses, the sensory and psychological overload was catastrophic. The sheer, concentrated absurdity of the attack bypassed all of his elite defenses. Ibisu's internal pressure spiked with violent, lethal velocity. A massive, comical geyser of blood erupted from his nose with the force of a ruptured geyser, a physiological response to the overwhelming shock. His eyes rolled back into his head, his rigid posture crumbled, and the elite Jonin was launched backward through the air by the sheer physiological impact of the display, crashing into the dirt, completely and utterly unconscious. As the dust settled in the clearing, Naruto released the jutsu. The dozens of clones vanished in simultaneous puffs of white smoke, leaving the quiet reality of the forest behind. The true Naruto stood over the deeply unconscious form of the elite tutor, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. Konohamaru stared at the scene in absolute starry-eyed awe. To the young boy, Naruto had just achieved the impossible. He had taken down an elite Jonin with a technique that defied all traditional logic. Konohamaru's eyes shined with the belief that he had finally found it, the ultimate magical shortcut. He believed that with Naruto's guidance, he could easily bypass the years of grueling, painful training and simply trick his way to the top of the village hierarchy. But as Naruto turned to face Konohamaru, the goofy, defiant grin had completely vanished from his face. The atmosphere in the clearing shifted dramatically, losing its comedic edge and settling into a heavy, solemn gravity. Naruto looked at Konohamaru, his blue eyes piercing through the boy's naive enthusiasm, reaching deep into the shared core of their mutual isolation. Naruto knelt down so he was eye level with the Third Hokage's grandson. The lesson he was about to impart was the most critical philosophy he possessed, the very foundational doctrine that would guide his entire existence. He spoke with a quiet, fierce intensity that demanded absolute attention. He told Konohamaru that the jutsu was just a trick. It was a momentarily effective distraction, but it was not strength. He explained with the hard-earned wisdom of a boy who had fought for every single inch of his survival that there is no easy path to greatness. You cannot bypass the system by fighting an old man. You cannot cheat the curriculum with a cheap illusion. And you cannot demand respect simply by possessing a title. There were no shortcuts to becoming the Hokage. "If you want to be Hokage," Naruto said, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable conviction, "you gotta fight for it, really fight for it, and I'm going to win." The words struck Konohamaru like a physical blow, dismantling his childish delusions of grandeur and replacing them with a terrifying, beautiful reality. The path to having his own name recognized would be long, agonizing, and fraught with failure. But looking at Naruto, a boy who possessed nothing yet carried the undeniable aura of a future leader, Konohamaru realized that the struggle was the exact mechanism that forged a true Hokage. Naruto extended his hand, pointing directly at the boy's chest. In that fading twilight, amidst the quiet rustle of the ancient trees, he elevated Konohamaru from the status of an annoying, privileged child to an equal. He declared them rivals. He promised that they would both strive for the ultimate title, that neither would ever take a shortcut, and that one day, when they had both earned the right to stand at the pinnacle of the ninja world, they would fight each other for the right to claim it.